For years, people in Hollywood have loved to talk about the friendship and rivalry between Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. These two legends have worked together, shared scenes that movie fans call unforgettable, and yet behind the scenes there were always quiet whispers. Some said they admired each other deeply. Others said they secretly competed for the same spotlight. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. Whenever Pacino and De Niro were in the same room, there was an energy that couldn't be ignored. It all began decades ago. Both actors came from similar roots, New York neighborhoods, tough upbringings, and a burning desire to prove themselves. They both rose through the film world during the 1970s, when cinema was raw, emotional, and powerful. Pacino made his mark with The Godfather and Serpico, while De Niro shook audiences with Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. They didn't just play characters, they became them. Every expression, every pause, every whisper of dialogue carried meaning. They made acting look like art. Because of that, fans and the media loved to compare them. Who was the better actor? Who gave more intense performances? Who deserved more Oscars? Every time one of them released a film, the other's work was brought up in the same conversation. For years, both men handled it with class, at least in public. They praised each other in interviews, smiled on red carpets, and even joked about their so-called rivalry. But in private, it wasn't always so simple. Hollywood insiders noticed that Pacino and De Niro rarely attended the same events unless they had to. When they did, they kept things polite but distant. Their friendship, though real, was complicated. They were two men who had walked the same road, achieved similar success, but carried very different energies. Pacino was fiery, full of emotion, intensity, and instinct. De Niro was quiet, controlled, methodical, almost unreadable. Together they balanced each other like fire and ice, but sometimes that mix could burn. One evening in Los Angeles, both men were invited to a major awards show. The event was packed with stars, directors, producers, the biggest names in Hollywood, all under one roof. Pacino was set to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his incredible career. De Niro was attending as a presenter and guest of honor. The night was meant to be a celebration of art, legacy, and friendship. But as it often happens in Hollywood, things didn't go exactly as planned. When De Niro took the stage to present an award,
he added a few off-script comments, the kind of unscripted humor he sometimes used to break the ice.
At one point, he made a playful remark about actors who always play themselves no matter the movie. The audience laughed, not realizing how that line might be taken. Cameras caught Pacino smiling politely in his seat, but behind that smile, something shifted. Some people sitting near him noticed he stopped clapping after that line. It wasn't that Pacino couldn't take a joke. He'd heard plenty of them in his career. But this one, on that night in front of that crowd, felt different. It hit a nerve. Maybe it was because he was already emotional about receiving the award. Maybe it was because he'd been compared to De Niro for half his life. Or maybe deep down it was because the line came from someone he once called a friend. Whatever the reason, the air around him grew heavier. After the segment, the show continued as usual. The cameras focused on other stars, the music played, and the crowd kept clapping. But backstage, there was a quiet tension. A few crew members whispered that Pacino had left his table earlier than expected. His assistant followed close behind. Nobody thought much of it. Not yet. De Niro, meanwhile, returned backstage after his presentation. He seemed relaxed, chatting with a few producers and shaking hands. But before he could make it to his dressing room, he noticed someone waiting near the corridor. Al Pacino. The look on Pacino's face said it all. He wasn't smiling. Witnesses would later describe the moment as intense but quiet. There were no cameras, no bright lights, just the two men. Decades of history between them. Pacino crossed his arms and asked a simple question, something like, "Was that joke supposed to be about me?" His tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight. De Niro, taken aback, tried to keep things calm. He said something short, maybe even brushed it off, but that only made things worse. Pacino took a step closer. His eyes locked on De Niro's. The silence stretched, and the crew standing nearby could feel the temperature in the room drop. Both men had worked together before in Heat and The Irishman, and they respected each other deeply. But in that moment, all the old tension, all the years of comparison seemed to spill into the open. It was no longer just about a joke. It was about everything that had built up over time. For years, both had tried to downplay the idea that they were rivals. They'd said all the right things in interviews, that they admired each other, that there was no competition, that they were simply two actors doing their best. But deep inside, both knew how the industry worked. There's only so much space at the top. Every award, every headline, every Best Actor title was a quiet reminder that one of them might be seen as the greater legend. That night, those feelings couldn't stay buried anymore. The confrontation didn't explode into shouting or violence. It was more subtle, sharper, colder. De Niro tried to explain that his joke wasn't meant personally, but Pacino wasn't convinced. He had that intense look he often carried in his movie roles, the kind that could stop a person in their tracks. For a few long seconds, the world-famous actors looked at each other not as friends or colleagues, but as men who'd spent a lifetime being measured against each other. A nearby stagehand later described it perfectly. It wasn't a fight. It was two storms meeting in the same sky. Eventually, De Niro nodded, muttered something about respect, and walked off. Pacino stayed still for a moment, then turned the other way. Neither said another word. By the time they both returned to the audience, their expressions were calm again, as if nothing had happened. Cameras caught them clapping for the next award, smiling politely, perfectly composed. To the crowd and the viewers at home, it looked like another ordinary night in Hollywood. But backstage, the story was already spreading. People talked quietly in corners, wondering if the two legends had finally reached a breaking point. For the rest of the evening, they avoided each other. When the show ended, Pacino left first, slipping out a side exit with his assistant. De Niro stayed behind a bit longer, chatting with a few directors and actors. When asked about the joke later, he reportedly just shrugged and said, "It's all in good fun." But those who'd seen the backstage exchange weren't so sure. That night became one of those whispered Hollywood tales, and the kind you don't see on camera but everyone seems to know about. Some said it was nothing more than a misunderstanding between two proud artists. Others believed it was years of bottled-up feelings finally showing through. Either way, one thing was certain. Something had changed. The next morning, entertainment blogs picked up on the rumor. Pacino and De Niro clashed backstage, and one headline said. Publicists for both actors quickly denied it, saying everything was fine, that the two were friends as always. But for those who knew the real story, the truth wasn't so easy to hide. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't violence, and it was human. Two men who had given their lives to the craft of acting, standing face to face, confronting not just each other but their shared history. And though the world would see them side by side again, smiling, shaking hands, promoting new projects, those who had been backstage that night would never forget the look in their eyes. Because behind the fame, the awards, and the movie posters, they were still human, proud, emotional, and imperfect. That was the night when the line between friendship and rivalry finally blurred, if only for a moment. Backstage at the awards show, the air was buzzing with movement. Producers rushing to keep things on schedule, assistants whispering into headsets, camera operators adjusting angles. The bright lights from the stage barely reached the quiet hallways behind the curtains. That's where Al Pacino waited, his expression calm on the surface but his mind clearly racing. He'd heard the joke De Niro made on stage, and no matter how much he tried to brush it off, it stayed in his head, echoing like a bell he couldn't unhear. He wasn't angry the way people get in fights. It wasn't that kind of feeling. It was something deeper, disappointment mixed with confusion. After all, De Niro wasn't just another actor. They'd shared long days on film sets, late-night talks about acting, about life, about what fame does to a person. So why would De Niro say something like that, especially in front of the entire industry? Pacino stood near the wall, his hands behind his back, just thinking. His assistant whispered something about his next segment, but he barely responded. He was replaying the moment in his head, the audience laughing, De Niro's calm tone, and that small smile that followed the line. Maybe it wasn't meant to sting, but it did. A few minutes later, the backstage door opened and De Niro walked in. He looked the same as always, calm, collected, the kind of man who never seemed to lose control. He was still wearing that slight grin, chatting with one of the producers about the next category. He didn't notice Pacino at first, but when he finally did, he stopped walking. The noise around them suddenly felt distant. "Hey," De Niro said softly, his voice casual, like nothing had happened. "You good?" Pacino didn't answer right away. He took a small breath, looked him straight in the eye, and said quietly, "Was that joke about me?" The people nearby pretended not to hear, but everyone could feel the tension. The hallway went still. De Niro blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "No, it wasn't," he said after a moment, waving a hand like he wanted to move past it. "It was just a bit. You know how these shows are." Pacino tilted his head, not fully convinced. His voice was calm but firm. "It didn't sound like a bit. You know how people take things. They'll run with that." De Niro sighed, shifting his weight. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "Come on, Al, you know me better than that." But Pacino wasn't letting it go so easily. "I do know you," he said quietly. "That's why I'm asking." It wasn't shouting, it wasn't dramatic, but there was something raw in Pacino's tone that hit harder than any argument. It was the kind of voice that carried history behind it. Decades of shared respect, maybe even a touch of rivalry that had been hidden for years. De Niro looked away for a second, glancing at the floor before meeting Pacino's eyes again. "Listen," he said, softer this time, "it wasn't personal. I was trying to lighten the room. Maybe it came out wrong." Pacino nodded slowly but didn't say much. He looked down for a second, then back up as if searching for the right words. "You could have said a lot of things," he murmured. "But that line, it sounded like you were talking about me." There was silence between them, not awkward but heavy. The kind of silence where two people are thinking the same thing, but neither wants to say it out loud. A crew member walked by carrying a stack of cue cards, glancing nervously at the two actors before disappearing down the hallway. Finally, De Niro said, "We've been through too much for this kind of thing to come between us." Pacino nodded again, but his expression stayed thoughtful. He wasn't trying to fight. He just wanted to be understood. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we have." A few seconds passed before De Niro offered a small smile, not fake, just a bit strained. "You know how this business is," he said. "People will always try to make something out of nothing. Let's not give them that." Pacino looked at him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Maybe you're right." But the truth was the comment had touched something real, something that had been there for years. It wasn't just about the joke. It was about how both men had lived under each other's shadows for decades. One moment they were being praised as equals, the next the world was comparing them again. Who gave the better performance, who aged better, who carried more legacy. They'd both learned to smile through it, but deep down it weighed on them. As De Niro turned to leave, Pacino stayed where he was. He leaned against the wall, lost in thought. Behind his calm face, his mind was still running, not with anger, but reflection. Maybe De Niro was right, maybe it was all just a misunderstanding, but it was hard not to feel that the world had pushed them into a silent competition neither of them had asked for. Around them, the backstage area came back to life. Assistants hurried by, sound techs carried cables, and producers whispered into microphones. To everyone else, it was just another night at another show. But for those who had seen what happened in that quiet corner, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. One of the stage crew, an older man who had worked with both actors before, later said that it was like watching two old friends trying not to let pride ruin a bond. He said there was no shouting, no insults, just emotion. Real raw emotion that you rarely see from people who've spent their lives in front of cameras. After a few minutes, Pacino finally took a deep breath and walked toward his dressing room. He sat down in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The lights around the mirror made his face glow softly. He looked tired, not physically but emotionally. A long night, he thought. A long life in this business. He picked up a small glass of water, took a sip, and exhaled slowly. He thought about the first time he met De Niro. Young, hungry actors in New York, chasing the same dreams. Back then, they were just two guys trying to survive in a city that didn't care who you were. They respected each other because they understood the struggle. Now, decades later, that same respect was still there, but layered with everything that comes with fame, pride, comparison, and the pressure to always be perfect. He knew De Niro wasn't a cruel man. Maybe the line really was innocent. Maybe Pacino had just taken it too personally because of the night's emotions. Still, something about the way it was said, the timing, the crowd's laughter. It had felt like a jab, whether it was meant that way or not. Meanwhile, De Niro had returned to his own dressing room. He sat down, quietly removed his jacket, and looked into his mirror too. He shook his head slightly and sighed. He didn't mean for the joke to hurt anyone, especially not Pacino. He'd always respected the man, his energy, his craft, his passion. But he also knew how sensitive actors could be, especially when their work was mentioned. They lived for their art, and any small comment about it could feel personal. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a moment, and muttered, "It's nothing. It'll blow over." But deep down, even he felt uneasy. Something about the exchange stayed in his mind. He knew Pacino wasn't the kind of man who'd bring something up unless it truly bothered him. The two had seen each other's tempers before, both on and off camera. They'd seen what ego could do to people in this industry, and they both knew that sometimes the smallest misunderstandings could grow into stories that never die. As the night went on, the show ended, the lights dimmed, and the guests began to leave. Pacino and De Niro both exited through different doors, both surrounded by assistants and security, both looking calm for the cameras. But those who caught their faces up close said neither of them looked happy. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, heavier, like two friends standing at a distance, unsure of how to close the gap. By the next morning, the rumor mill had already started turning. Some people backstage had whispered about what they saw. Someone told a journalist that things got tense, and by noon, social media was full of speculation. Both actors' representatives quickly denied everything, calling it a complete exaggeration. Still, fans couldn't stop talking. After all, these weren't just any two actors. They were legends. And when legends collide, the world listens. And so, even though the night ended peacefully, the story was far from over. Both men went back to their routines, acting like nothing had happened. But sometimes silence says more than words. Something small, maybe unspoken, had shifted between them, and deep down, both knew it. That quiet moment backstage wasn't just about a joke. It was about pride, legacy, and the weight of a lifetime spent under the same bright light. The next few minutes after that quiet backstage moment felt like hours. Everyone went back to their jobs, pretending nothing had happened, but people could sense the tension in the air. It was like the space between Al Pacino and Robert De Niro was filled with words neither wanted to say out loud. Pacino had returned to his seat, trying to focus on the rest of the show. The host's jokes, the applause, the performances, it all blurred together. Every time the camera turned toward him, he smiled politely, nodded, even clapped along, but his mind wasn't really there. That one exchange backstage kept playing over and over in his head. He wasn't angry anymore, just unsettled. Maybe De Niro really hadn't meant anything by it. Maybe it was just an awkward choice of words. But then again, Pacino had been in this industry long enough to know that sometimes jokes hide small truths, and when those truths come from people you trust, they sting a little more. Meanwhile, backstage, De Niro sat in his dressing room trying to let it go. But something about the look in Pacino's eyes stayed with him. It wasn't the look of someone who was angry. It was the look of someone who felt hurt. De Niro respected Pacino too much to want that. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead, and sighed. Maybe I shouldn't have said it, he thought. The show ended, and both men went their separate ways that night, each surrounded by assistants and reporters asking for comments. They both smiled for the cameras, gave polite answers, and tried to look as if everything was normal. But once the lights dimmed and the red carpet emptied, both men were left with the same quiet thought. Something between them had shifted. Over the next few days, Hollywood couldn't stop talking. Whispers about a backstage moment between the two legends started spreading fast. Reporters asked questions, fans speculated online, and entertainment blogs hinted that tension had been brewing for years. When Pacino read one of those articles the next morning, he felt a mix of frustration and sadness. This was exactly what he didn't want. A small misunderstanding turned into a headline. He turned off his phone, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat quietly for a while. It wasn't the kind of attention he enjoyed. He thought about calling De Niro, but something stopped him. Maybe pride, maybe hesitation. Sometimes even the closest of friends find it hard to pick up the phone after an awkward moment. And for men like Pacino and De Niro, who had always been private, who'd never worn their emotions on their sleeves, saying, "Hey, maybe we should talk," wasn't as simple as it sounded. On the other side of the city, De Niro was feeling the same way. He'd gotten a few calls from colleagues who'd heard about the incident. Some laughed it off, others asked what really happened. He kept his answers short, saying, "It's nothing. Don't believe everything you hear." But when he hung up, he sat there in silence for a long time. He knew how things worked in Hollywood. People loved stories about conflict, especially between two icons. The media had done this for years, building up rivalries between actors who were really just trying to do their jobs. But this time it felt different because it wasn't just a rumor. There had been tension, and that bothered him. A few days later, both actors happened to attend a private dinner event for an upcoming film project. They didn't know they'd both be there. When Pacino arrived, he was surprised to see De Niro already sitting at the table, talking to the director. Their eyes met for a brief second. That same quiet recognition between two people who had more history than words could explain. The room grew a little quieter as people noticed. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone could sense the tension. Hollywood gatherings were usually full of fake smiles and small talk, but this one suddenly felt heavier. De Niro stood up first. He walked toward Pacino slowly, without hesitation but also without a smile. Pacino didn't move, but his eyes followed every step. When they finally stood face to face, De Niro broke the silence. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm. Pacino nodded slightly. "I'm fine," he said. There was a pause. The kind of pause that carries everything unspoken. Pride, respect, maybe even regret. De Niro sighed. "I shouldn't have made that joke. It was a stupid thing to say. I was trying to be funny, but it came out wrong." Pacino looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded. "It's fine," he said softly. "Just caught me off guard." The director, who'd been watching from the corner of the room, smiled quietly, pretending to look away. It wasn't the most dramatic apology, but it was real. It came from two men who didn't need big words to understand each other. They sat down together at the table. The conversation started slow, with the usual small talk. Movies, family, the new project. But as the night went on, their voices softened, the old rhythm between them slowly returning. For a moment, it felt like the old days again. Two actors sharing stories, laughing, talking about their craft like students of the same art. But deep down, something had changed. Pacino couldn't help but notice how much older they'd both gotten, how the years had softened them but also made them more fragile in ways they didn't show. They'd both spent their lives being praised, criticized, compared, and analyzed. And now, sitting across from each other, they could finally see what that had done to them. As the dinner went on, someone mentioned their movie Heat. Everyone at the table smiled, remembering how powerful that film was. "That was history," one of the producers said. "You two made magic on screen." Pacino laughed, but there was a hint of something bittersweet in his voice. "Yeah," he said. "It was special." De Niro nodded. "We had a good run," he said quietly. They shared a small smile, the kind of smile that comes from understanding, not from words. Later that night, as the guests started leaving, Pacino and De Niro walked out together. Outside, the air was cool, the city lights flickering in the distance. They stood near the curb, waiting for their cars, not saying much. Then Pacino turned and said softly, "You know, sometimes I think people like seeing us as rivals more than friends." De Niro gave a short laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Makes for a better story, I guess." Pacino nodded. "Maybe, but it's not the truth." De Niro looked at him, then said, "No, it's not." A moment of silence followed. Calm, honest, peaceful. When their cars arrived, they shook hands briefly before parting ways. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, no emotional speeches or dramatic music. Just two old friends finally letting the tension fade into the night. But still, even after that, the story didn't stop. The public loved to read between the lines. Photos of them from that night were shared everywhere. Captions like "Pacino and De Niro reunite after rumored feud" filled social media. Both men ignored it. They'd learned long ago that once a story hits the public, it takes on a life of its own. In the following weeks, both men returned to work on their respective projects. Life went on. Interviews came and went, and though journalists tried to dig into the backstage moment, both actors kept things professional. When asked about it, Pacino smiled and said, "We've been friends for a long time. That's all that matters." De Niro said something similar, brushing off the rumors with a calm grin. Behind closed doors, though, They both thought about how easily a simple misunderstanding had almost turned into something bigger. Fame had given them everything: recognition, legacy, success. But it had also taken away privacy and peace. Every gesture, every word, every expression was watched, judged, and interpreted by millions. That night, when Pacino got home after the dinner, he sat quietly by the window, looking out at the city. The noise of Hollywood was far away, but the memories of his long career were right there in his mind. Every role, every award, every moment that brought him here. He smiled softly and whispered to himself, "After all these years, it still matters." Across town, De Niro did the same, sitting in his living room, sipping a drink, lost in thought. He didn't think about fame or awards. He thought about the years they'd spent side by side, the times they'd supported each other, and the strange way the world liked to pit them against each other. He shook his head and smiled faintly. "It's funny," he said quietly. "People always want a story." And in a way, they were right. People did want a story. But what happened that week wasn't about anger or rivalry. It was about pride, misunderstanding, and two men learning that even the strongest friendships can be tested, not by hate, but by ego and silence. That was the real story. Not the rumors, not the headlines, just two legends, two humans finding their way back to understanding. The days after that quiet dinner passed slowly. On the surface, everything seemed back to normal. Both Al Pacino and Robert De Niro returned to work, attending meetings, reading scripts, and doing interviews. But inside, something still lingered. A thin layer of uneasiness that neither wanted to admit was there. They had cleared the air, yes, but deep down, both knew the moment backstage had left a small mark. Not a wound, just a reminder of how fragile pride could be, even for men who had lived their entire lives under bright lights. Pacino tried not to think about it much. He threw himself into his next film project. The long shooting days and quiet nights on set gave him something else to focus on. But once in a while, between takes, he would catch himself thinking about De Niro, about their conversation, their shared past, the look in his friend's eyes that night. It wasn't anger anymore, just reflection. One evening after filming, he sat alone in his trailer, going through an old photo album someone had brought him. Inside were pictures from years ago, behind-the-scenes moments from Heat, a film that had brought both men together in one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. He smiled faintly at a photo of them laughing between takes, their faces younger, freer. Back then, there had been no awkwardness, no hesitation, just two artists doing what they loved. He closed the album gently and leaned back in his chair. Time had changed a lot of things. The fame, the recognition, the awards, they were blessings, but they came with their own kind of loneliness. He wondered if De Niro ever felt the same way. Across the country, De Niro was also on a new set, preparing for a different project. The director had asked him to play a quiet, introspective role, something that mirrored the reflective mood he was already in. Between takes, he kept mostly to himself, staying calm and reserved as always, but those who worked with him could tell his thoughts were somewhere else. Late one afternoon, while waiting for a scene to be lit, the director casually mentioned Pacino's name. "You and Al, you two made magic together," he said, smiling. "It's rare to see that kind of chemistry these days." De Niro nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said softly. "It was something special." The director laughed. "You guys should do one more movie together before you both retire. The world needs that." De Niro gave a faint smile but didn't answer. He knew the idea sounded good on paper, but in reality it wasn't that simple. Sometimes the hardest thing wasn't working with someone again. It was facing everything that came with it. The comparisons, the expectations, the constant public microscope. Still, the thought of one last collaboration with Pacino stuck in his mind. A few weeks later, fate seemed to have its own plans. Both actors were invited to appear together at a special tribute event in New York, a celebration of classic cinema, honoring legendary performances that had changed film history. They were both listed as guests of honor. When Pacino's assistant showed him the invitation, he raised his eyebrows. "De Niro's going too?" "Yes," the assistant said. "They want both of you there. It's a big night." Pacino didn't respond for a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The night of the tribute, the theater was filled with energy. Every seat was taken, cameras lined the aisles, and the air buzzed with excitement. Old movie clips played on the big screen. The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Heat, The Irishman, all reminders of how deeply both men had shaped cinema. Pacino arrived first, dressed simply but elegantly, greeting people with that calm, familiar smile. Minutes later, De Niro entered. When the crowd saw him, applause filled the room. For a brief second, both men caught each other's eyes across the stage. There was no awkwardness, just quiet understanding. When they finally stood together under the bright lights side by side, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The sound was warm, genuine, endless. They both smiled, glancing at each other with that old spark of friendship. As the night went on, they were invited to sit down for a conversation on stage. The moderator asked questions about their careers, their favorite roles, and what it had been like to work together. At first, they kept it light, sharing small jokes, teasing each other, making the audience laugh. It felt easy again, like old times. But then the moderator asked a deeper question. "You've both been compared your entire careers," he said. "Did that ever bother either of you?" The room went quiet. Pacino looked at De Niro. De Niro looked back, smiling faintly. "People will always compare," De Niro said finally. "It's human nature. But for us, it was never really about that." Pacino nodded slowly. "Yeah, we both did what we loved. That's what matters." The audience clapped again, but behind their calm words, both men felt the weight of truth. The comparisons had been there from the start. The constant competition the world had created between them. They had learned to live with it, even laugh about it. But deep inside, it had affected them more than they ever admitted. After the event, they walked together backstage, away from the cameras. There was a quiet peace between them now, a sense that they'd finally said everything that needed to be said without actually saying it. Then suddenly, something unexpected happened. As they reached the dressing area, a small group of photographers who had somehow slipped past security appeared at the door. The flashes went off bright and blinding. Both men raised their hands to block the lights. "Gentlemen, one quick shot together," one of the photographers called out. For a moment, neither of them reacted. Pacino gave a tired sigh, and De Niro just looked at him, half smiling. Then Pacino said quietly, "Let's give them what they want." They stood side by side, facing the cameras. The photographers clicked rapidly, calling out their names. The lights flashed again and again, freezing that moment forever. But as the flashes went off, something strange happened. Both men began to laugh. Not forced laughter, but real laughter, the kind that comes from letting go. It broke the tension instantly. The photographers laughed too, not even knowing why. When it was over, Pacino clapped De Niro on the shoulder. "See," he said with a grin. "Still good at putting on a show." De Niro chuckled. Some habits never die. As they walked out together into the cool night air, away from the crowd and cameras, there was a quiet ease between them, the kind that comes only after a storm has passed. They didn't need to apologize anymore. They didn't need to explain. They both knew what that small backstage confrontation had really been about. Not ego, not anger, but something more human. The fear of being misunderstood by someone you care about. For the first time in a long while, they talked freely again, about family, about aging, about how the world of film had changed. They joked about how young directors now called them sir, and how their old movies were studied in film schools. "You know," Pacino said with a smile, "I never thought we'd still be doing this after all these years." De Niro nodded. "Neither did I, but here we are." They both laughed quietly, their voices echoing down the empty corridor. Later, as they reached their cars, De Niro turned to Pacino. "You ever think about how lucky we got?" Pacino raised an eyebrow. "Lucky?" "Yeah," De Niro said. "We got to do what we love. We got to live it." Pacino smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." They shook hands one more time, this time longer, firmer. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a silent promise that the past was behind them. As their cars drove off in different directions, the night grew still again. The city lights shimmered. The traffic hummed in the distance, and somewhere, the story of their friendship, with all its ups and downs, quietly settled into another chapter. In the following days, the pictures from that night spread everywhere. The internet was full of headlines. Pacino and De Niro together again, friendship stronger than ever. Interviews replayed their quotes. and fans celebrated their reunion. Neither man commented publicly, but those who knew them said both smiled when they saw the photos. It was funny how life worked. One small misunderstanding had turned into weeks of tension, only to end in laughter and peace. And maybe that's how it was always meant to be. Two men who had spent their lives chasing perfection, learning, again, that sometimes the most human thing you can do is forgive, laugh, and move on. For all their fame and glory, in the end, they were just two friends trying to understand each other in a world that never stopped watching. Weeks passed after that unforgettable night at the tribute event. The photos of Al Pacino and Robert De Niro standing side by side, smiling and laughing, had gone viral everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, and online platforms all talked about it. Fans said it was a historic moment. Two legends reunited not just as actors but as friends. But for both of them, that night wasn't about cameras or applause. It was about peace, the kind that comes when two people finally let go of the past. Pacino went back to Los Angeles. His home was quiet, filled with the soft ticking of a clock and the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. One evening, as he sat in his living room, he scrolled through an old tablet filled with messages and photos from fans. Most of them had written about how much they loved seeing him and De Niro together again. He smiled faintly. It felt good to know that after everything, the years, the fame, the differences, people still saw something special in their bond. But fame wasn't what mattered to him anymore. What mattered now were the small, real things, having dinner with friends, reading a good script, watching the sunset without needing to rush somewhere. He had lived a long life in front of cameras. Now he enjoyed the quiet moments away from them. Still, every now and then his mind wandered back to that night. The laughter, the handshake, the feeling that after so many years, they were finally back on the same page. Across the country, De Niro's life had also settled into a comfortable rhythm. He spent more time at home, visiting family and working on small projects that inspired him rather than chasing the next big film. He too had seen the flood of headlines about their reunion, and every time someone mentioned it, he would just smile. In one interview, a reporter asked him, "How's your relationship with Al these days?" De Niro smiled softly before answering, "It's good. Always has been, really. We've just had our moments, like anyone else." The reporter nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. But there was more behind those few words. Years of shared history, unspoken understanding, and the kind of friendship that only comes from walking the same long, unpredictable road together. A few months later, both men were invited to another film festival, this time overseas. They weren't there to promote a movie, but to attend a special event celebrating the art of storytelling. Their names were listed among the honorary guests. Pacino wasn't sure he wanted to travel again. The long flights, the media rush, and it all felt tiring. But when he heard De Niro had already agreed to go, he paused for a moment and then smiled. "All right," he said to his assistant. "Book the ticket." When the festival began, the atmosphere was magical. It was held in a beautiful old European city, surrounded by history and art. On the opening night, lights sparkled across the red carpet, and fans lined the streets holding posters and photographs. When Pacino stepped out of the car, the crowd cheered his name. A few minutes later, De Niro arrived. As soon as they saw each other, they both laughed. Not the nervous laughter of strangers, but the warm kind that comes when you see an old friend after a long journey. "Didn't think I'd see you here," De Niro said, smiling as they shook hands. "Yeah, well," Pacino said, adjusting his jacket. "You know how it is, and I couldn't let you steal all the attention." De Niro chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." They walked together into the grand hall side by side. Inside, the organizers had prepared a tribute reel, scenes from their most famous films, their collaborations, and even a few rare behind-the-scenes clips showing them laughing, rehearsing, or sharing a quiet coffee on set. As they sat there watching the montage, both men grew quiet. The room was filled with applause, but in that moment all they could feel was nostalgia. Decades of memories, the long shoots, the arguments, the breakthroughs, all flashing before them like a lifetime replaying in seconds. Pacino leaned over slightly and said under his breath, "We really did a lot, didn't we?" De Niro nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "We really did." Later that night, they were invited to give a short speech together. The crowd waited, phones ready, hoping for another iconic moment. De Niro spoke first. "When you've been doing this as long as we have," he said, "you start realizing it's not about being the best or getting the biggest role. It's about the people you meet along the way, the ones who push you, challenge you, and make you better." Pacino smiled, listening closely. Then it was his turn. "We've known each other a long time," he began, looking at De Niro. "And I think what keeps it special is respect. That's something you can't fake. You either have it or you don't." The crowd applauded, but the two men barely noticed. They were looking at each other, nodding slightly, like they both understood something words couldn't fully say. After the speech, they stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was cool, and the city lights shimmered across the river nearby. They stood there for a while, silent, just taking it all in. Pacino broke the silence first. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly. De Niro raised an eyebrow. "You mean after all this?" Pacino nodded. "Yeah, after the films, after the cameras, after the noise." De Niro thought for a moment, then said, "I think what comes next is peace. Maybe that's all any of us really want at the end, a little peace." Pacino smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "I like that." They both stood there for a while longer, watching the water move slowly under the bridge. In the days that followed, they appeared at a few more panels and interviews, sharing stories from their careers, joking with the audience and reminiscing about old times. But behind every smile there was a deeper feeling, a quiet gratitude for still being here, still sharing these moments after everything they'd been through. Before leaving the festival, De Niro invited Pacino to dinner one last time. It wasn't in a fancy restaurant this time, just a small place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The table was near a window overlooking the street, where people walked by unaware that two of cinema's greatest were sitting right there, laughing softly over plates of pasta and a bottle of red wine. Their conversation flowed easily, about life, about getting older, about the strange journey that fame had taken them on. "You know," Pacino said, "we've spent so many years in front of the world, pretending to be other people. Sometimes I forget who I really am." De Niro nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, but maybe that's the thing. All those characters, all those stories, they're part of us too." Pacino smiled. "Maybe that's true." As the night went on, they talked less and listened more, to the quiet hum of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the sound of distant laughter. There was something peaceful about it, something that didn't need words. When the bill came, De Niro reached for it. "I've got this one," he said firmly. Pacino grinned. "You always say that." "Yeah," De Niro replied. "And I always mean it." They both laughed again, that familiar, unguarded laughter that had become so rare in their lives. After dinner, they stepped out into the cool night. The streets were mostly empty, the lamps casting a soft golden glow on the cobblestones. They walked together for a bit, talking about nothing and everything, the kind of conversation that doesn't need a destination. At one point, Pacino stopped and looked up at the sky. "You ever think about how fast it all went?" De Niro followed his gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Too fast." They stood there for a long time, two old friends in the middle of a sleeping city, surrounded by silence and memory. Finally, Pacino turned to him and said, "Whatever happens next, I'm glad we talked that night. You know, the one backstage. Maybe that was supposed to happen." De Niro smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe it was." They shook hands one last time before parting ways for the night. No photographers, no audience, no flashing lights, just two men walking away in opposite directions, both at peace. In the weeks that followed, life went on. Each returned to his own world, to new projects, new routines, but the bond between them remained, quiet, steady, unbroken. Whenever someone asked about their friendship now, they both said the same thing. "It's good. Always has been." And maybe that was the truth, not perfect, not simple, but real. Because behind the fame and the cameras, behind the awards and applause, they were just two human beings who had spent a lifetime trying to understand each other. And in the end, that was what made their story timeless. Not the films, not the fame, but the friendship that survived it all,